Welcome back to An Awakened Life. My name is Reese,
And I'm Quinn.
and today we are tackling what is consciousness. Now, this is a very fun topic, and one that is going to be especially relevant to current events in my life. I just got back from a 8-day seminar on the integrated information theory of consciousness in Venice, which we will talk about more later, but that was a wonderful time. And I'd like to lay some foundations here. So before we get into all of those nitty-gritty details, Quinn, what is consciousness? What are we talking about?
Um, well, as we may have discussed a little before, my kind of go-to explanation is that consciousness is any individual's entire universe. For me, my consciousness is my entire experience. I have nothing else, and any sort of physical dead reality that exists outside of my consciousness is actually just my experience within my consciousness because I cannot directly experience those dead inanimate objects outside of me. All that I have is my entire experience. And a consequence of this is that consciousness is extraordinarily difficult to talk about and explain because normal language typically refers to and assumes that there are external physical objects out there. That is a rock. That thing exists. But what I'm saying is that I don't know that that thing exists. Consciousness is empty and pure, so to speak.
This is again one of the attributes that I think really what it means to even be awakened in the first place, right?
Yeah.
What it means to be awakened, I think, is to be aware of this fact that all of the things that you are observing in the world are actually manifestations in your own consciousness. You perceive them through the window of your conscious experience.
And it doesn't matter whether it's an emotion that you're experiencing or a physical thing that you think that you're experiencing. Both of these are just appearing within consciousness, your own consciousness.
I was giving an analogy a little bit ago about the essentially the you as a conscious entity exist as a pilot in a plane, right? You observe the world through all of the dials on your dashboard and maybe through a glimpse through your window, but you don't get direct access to a material reality or an idealistic reality, for that example. Um, you exist sort of as this bubble of experience, and all of the external perceptions that you would observe about the world if you drop a ball on the ground and you observe its bounce, the object itself, the ball and its bounce on the ground and the exact form of its behavior are all phenomena. They are all appearances within your conscious space, if you will. And we take that for granted a lot of the time because one of the functions of the brain is to draw a box around the quote unquote you. And we've talked in previous episodes about the differences between you as in uppercase S self you, which is this whole conscious bubble of all of the things that you perceive in your conscious experience, and then lowercase s self, that version of you, which is the box your brain is drawing around your observer perspective and your body and things like that. And what we're talking about consciousness is really this dynamic of the difference between these selves and how both of those are contributing to the phenomenology of your experience, and there are simply different parts of it. The self that you would normally attribute to be you, the lowercase s self, is but an appearance in this space like any other.
So you've been studying this new set of theories and axioms and such, the integrated theory of consciousness,
Yes, it's called the integrated information theory, is the one that I am now most familiar with through this course.
which is what you've been studying in Venice.
Yes.
So, would you care to go over what are some of the main ideas of this theory? And this is my first time hearing it, so I don't know how it's going to uh, interact or not interact with my current understanding and or theories.
Yeah, and
So,
the integrated information theory, which I'll just call it IIT for short as an acronym, is one of the more developed theories of consciousness, and it really distinguishes itself from the other prominent theories of consciousness by not being a functionalist theory. And I'll explain what I mean a little bit by that. So, most traditional neuroscientific theories of consciousness, they fall along the same lines of functionalism. In other words, the brain is a processing machine, and there is some process in the machine that creates consciousness. That's a fairly popular worldview, at least within neuroscience, and sort of lines up with the general intuition of the brain is doing something complicated and we just don't understand it yet. But these functional theories of consciousness, just to name a few, the global workspace theory is one, which its main hypothesis is that you have some form of global representation in the brain, and when information gets broadcast into that global space, that's when it reaches your conscious experience. And there are other ones like the higher order thought theory, which is very similar. It's about how when you have higher order metacognition on your perceptions, that's when they become conscious, right? There's all of these different functionalist theories of there is some process the brain is doing that is making consciousness. And the problem with functionalism is that you run into this problem of trying to squeeze the juice of consciousness out of a brain, which is one of the things that the instructors of the IIT course were using to explain this, right? It's this analogy of you're trying to get phenomena, which is not a physical thing, right? You can't measure phenomena very easily. All you can do is ask someone, hey, did you experience this thing? And that's the closest that you get for measuring it. And this is the famous hard problem of consciousness, right? How do you get this very immaterial, experiential, mental aspect of your experience out of physical matter? And functionalist theories generally either ignore that question or they don't have a great way to address it. And IIT tries to address this by starting from phenomenology itself. And so the main idea is, what do I know about my conscious experience? What is my ground truth? What is the absolute truth of my current experience right now that I can start from as a baseline, right? So
can we just go over? I just want to make sure I understand this functional view of consciousness in contrast to IIT. I want to make sure I understand that correctly. So you're saying that functional is more of a scientific approach, where you're saying that if we take a certain number of variables or parameters, like we have this many carbon atoms interacting with each other in this exact way, we set up that environment such that that's true, then the consciousness that environment is going to experience is like you can predict it externally, and you can basically know what something else is consciously experiencing because this aligns with all of the other laws of the universe and that we've discovered so far. And the laws of the universe are deeply tied in with consciousness, whereas IIT is saying, no, you can't do that. You can't induce consciousness or predict consciousness based on measurable things.
So I see
it has to be an internal.
So there is a couple distinctions I want to make here, which is that I don't think, first of all, that IIT is necessarily a less scientific approach. It just so happens that most neuroscientists are very strict materialists, and so have a hard time sort of appreciating the experiential aspects of consciousness as a thing worth studying, which I think is really starting to change, and consciousness science has grown more mainstream, and a lot of the neuroscientists are moving away from that position, but it's still very prevalent in a lot of the theories of consciousness that you would see in sort of the presence of neuroscience labs and whatnot. So the functionalist approaches, basically all theories of consciousness have this idea that whatever the mechanism they're trying to attribute to making consciousness literally is consciousness. In other words, it's not like there is some dualistic additional layer that is correlated with this process in the brain. A lot of them predict that the experience of consciousness is literally identical to whatever functional process they're attributing it to. And this is, I think, a very popular position in science. No one in science likes to have a dualistic worldview, right? You're getting into religion and other dogmatic things as soon as you're attributing extra properties to your reality, right? And this is the hard problem of studying consciousness as a science, is that to get away from dualism, you have to take a few risks and make a few assumptions. And that's really where IIT comes into that. And IIT has some controversial critics because of those sort of tendencies, which we'll get into. But by making assumptions like that, you do buy yourself some extra prediction power, I would say. And but to answer your earlier question, basically all theories of consciousness are, the only way we're going to validate them is through correlation, which is really hard to separate from causation, right? If you have a process in the brain that you measure it and it correlates very strongly with changes in people's phenomena that you ask them, you just ask them, like, hey, did your phenomenology change in this way? And you can correlate things with processes in the brain by doing science that way. But that doesn't prove causation. It doesn't tell you anything about how consciousness becomes instantiated, right? It's just correlating how it behaves with some process in the brain, which is really the core problem with functionalism, is that you're never going to get to the hard problem of consciousness in that way. And IIT has an approach to this, and their approach, the phrase they use to describe it is an explanatory identity. In other words, can we explain something that has an identical structure to consciousness? And so by explaining it in identical forms, we can essentially show that they are the same thing. Like if they're isometric in every possible way, then we can show that they're the same thing. And that's like, in mathematics, that's how we do proofs, right? If two things are identical in every way, then they're the same thing.
Right, they're completely equivalent to each other.
Yeah, and so this is the IIT approach, is can we observe some aspects of phenomenology that have certain properties, and then identify those exact properties in some form of physical substrate that we can measure, and if they behave identically, then we have an explanatory identity. In other words, we can logically conclude that they are the same thing. And the problem with this angle of verification is that we can't measure phenomenology to a great enough degree of specificity to ever have like a completely validated theory. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't give us lots of useful tools to conduct experiments and to still create a very strong correlative identity, if you will. And so that's really where I think the value of theories like IIT come in.
So when you say behave, do you mean react, or do you mean like if you have an isolated particle and you have another identical particle, let's say they're both hydrogen atoms, and we're observing them under very isolated environments, and we're essentially just taking the electromagnetic radiation that they're both emitting, and we're measuring them, and we're looking at, are they the exact same? Is that kind of what you mean by see if they're identical?
Well, that is what I mean, but you can see how this is problematic for consciousness, right? Because if your conscious experience is behaving in a very specific and distinct way, how would you measure it to the great enough degree of specificity to say, yeah, that is behaving and is structured identically to this physical substrate that I'm observing, right? And so this is the verification problem of IIT. IIT has some incredibly precise mathematical formalisms for how a substrate will behave, and it through its observations of phenomenal experience, it can say, yes, phenomenal experience also behaves this way. But until we can measure phenomenal experience very, very precisely, we don't have a strong way of saying, yes, IIT is correct.
Right, because you would essentially need an infinite amount of explanation to 100% verify that they're exactly the same in every way. You would need to describe every possible facet of whatever conscious experience the subject is having.
Yes.
And
So
that's
that's problem one. Now, problem two, which is arguably the worst problem, is that the mathematical formalisms of the integrated information theory require such an insanely high degree of computation and just calculations that to even calculate like the effect of a substrate that would correspond to some conscious experience would take longer than the age of the universe in its current formulation. So, and we can talk about that in more specifics as I get into it, but there are problems on both sides of this explanatory identity principle in that
right
you,
because it's like, sorry, I'll let you continue in a second, but it's like it would take longer than the age of the universe for a modern computer to compute every possible arrangement of chess games. Um,
yes, and this is a good opportunity for me to transition into why this is in the integrated information theory. And the core idea of the integrated information theory that makes it different from functionalist theories is that it's not about what the brain is doing, right? If the brain is the substrate, it doesn't matter what process is running. It's not a process that makes consciousness. It's simply the way the brain is. It's the IIT phrase is it's about being, not about doing, right? And
right,
so
I completely agree with that.
I do as well. That aligns with my intuitions about how consciousness behaves and what it is that you can be conscious without doing anything. And I understand
Right,
that like your brain is doing lots of things all the time, even if you're in a resting state, right? People have brain activity in resting state. It's not like your brain's not doing anything. But
exactly.
the my intuition is that it is about being and not about doing. So I agree with that part. And the way that IIT formalizes this is you first ask, what does it mean to be, right? So to be in most philosophy is to have cause effect power. In other words, you must be able to cause things in the world, and things in the world must be able to cause effects on you. That's what it means to exist. So the entire theory of IIT is built on this principle of cause effect power. And you can do lots of mathematics with cause effect power to describe these very complicated structures and calculate metrics about how much cause effect power there is within a system. And that's what a lot of the IIT math is for. But the primary measurement problem here is that once you're trying to do math on a substrate and you say, okay, I have the brain has 100 billion neurons, right? Let's just assume the grain of our substrate is neurons for a moment, and that may not be true, and we can talk about that in more detail in a second. It's sort of a nuance of the theory, but let's assume it's neurons. We have 100 billion neurons, and in order to measure the cause-effect structure of 100 billion neurons, we can't just measure your brain activity, because measuring brain activity doesn't tell us anything about causation. In
That's
order
a
to,
functional view.
yes,
Yeah.
but to measure causation, like if you want to know what effect does this one neuron have on the rest of the system, you can't just measure it in accordance with the rest of the system, like behaving normally. What you need to do is you need to probe the neuron and figure out what happens when the rest of the system is fixed and like sort of left outside your observational window. What happens to it as an effect of me probing this one neuron? And it's only once you do the perturbation that you can measure the cause effect power, because cause effect power is fundamentally different from just correlations of activity. And this is one of the reasons why this is, in principle, impossible to measure, because in order to create a cause effect structural map, essentially, of how conscious your thing is, how the cause effect structures are actually linked, you would need to perturb every neuron in the brain individually, all within a specific time step. So if I want to characterize one specific experience of, say, you looking at a blank wall, I would need to, in that one instant of time that conscious experience exists, probe 100 billion neurons individually to figure out the overall cause-effect structure. And that's just to get to like a systemic measurement of, does this thing exist at all? Because there are levels of computation here in the theory. So first you have to figure out, does my substrate exist intrinsically for itself? And what that means is it does it have enough cause effect power on itself to essentially have a certain amount of integrated information. And by a certain amount, I just mean more than other possible combinations of the substrate or other sort of external background conditions, right? Because the theory predicts that you have some form of local maximum in your brain somewhere of this intrinsic cause-effect power that essentially shouts over and excludes all of the other neuron combinations and all of the other possible conscious entities that might otherwise exist, right? Because there is one you. There is one conscious experience. You're not conscious of multiple things.
Right. There's one you at any given time, and you're saying that that you in each moment is essentially the way that a certain number of neurons are currently interacting and being in your brain.
Yes, and these sets of neurons, like, for example, probably most of your brain is not part of whatever this complex is. There are many parts of your brain, for example, the cerebellum, that are very parallelized in the sense of they don't interact. It doesn't interact with itself a lot. It mostly just processes information in a parallel fashion. And that doesn't suit itself very well to the kind of integration that the theory says or predicts is important for consciousness. And so the theory would say the cerebellum is not part of the complex, most likely. And there are other parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is what makes humans really smart for the most part, is also sort of not really organized in a way that's very conducive to this sort of integration. And so there is probably a section of the brain, mostly towards the back of the brain, that has this very densely interconnected, very integrated sort of architecture that, because it exists in this way, it has a structure that lends itself to strong levels of integration and of intrinsicality, if you will. And this is perhaps a good moment to actually go over what the key parts of phenomenal experience that IIT says are important for consciousness. So I'll just breeze through them quickly. But to observe your intrinsic experience, we can know a few things as an absolute, right? For starters, it exists. We have to take that as meaningful. This is Descartes' first meditation, right? I think, therefore I am.
Therefore I am.
Yeah. And so we take existence for a fact. We also know that the system itself is it's intrinsic, right? It excludes things that aren't part of your conscious experience, right? Your consciousness isn't infinite.
Right. My current conscious experience is not that of my computer or my mom.
Yeah, and what it means to be intrinsic is that you have to exist for yourself. In other words, remove all of the external input, would you still exist for yourself, right? And when it means to exist for yourself is that it doesn't require some form of external observation, right? Your consciousness is entirely self-contained. It takes and it makes a difference within itself. And
so if I was cast out into the deepest part of space where there are no other particles, then I would still exist as myself until I'd freeze.
Yeah, your consciousness doesn't require an observer. It exists intrinsically.
Nobody else needs to confirm that I exist. I know that I exist because
Yes.
of the initial.
Correct. Yeah. The next axiom is that your consciousness is specific. It is this one. And the most obvious example of this is in the type of experiment I think is binocular rivalry, when if your eyes are seeing different things, like if you show one picture or one eye a picture of like a red house and the other one a picture of a blue dog or something like that, your conscious experience will only ever see one of them at a time. And you can flip between them, but you can never see both. And so that's what it means to be specific, is that you can only represent one experience at a time. The other axioms are integration. So your conscious experience is unitary. It is a whole. You can't reduce it to separate experiences, right? You aren't experiencing thing A and thing B as separate things. Your conscious experience is one thing. The next one is exclusion. So this is the one about your consciousness isn't infinite. It has to be definite. It is this whole, and by the reason it's called exclusion is because it is this whole, and it's definite. You can't have other like elements of your consciousness that are outside of it, right? And so if you define the borders of your consciousness, there can't be another consciousness that overlaps with it, is the theory. And I think this one is actually maybe up for debate a little bit, just because ontologically it seems like you can't really make claims about what other consciousnesses might exist, right? Maybe there is another consciousness that overlaps with mine. I just don't have access to it. So, but for the purposes of methodologically formulating this theory, I think it makes sense to say that we have to exclude other conscious entities that might overlap with yours. And then the last axiom is composition, which is that your experience is structured. So it's composed of distinctions and relations that sort of bind them all together, yielding your phenomenal structure, right? The most obvious example of this is spatial extendedness. And things have position relative to each other in your visual space, in your conscious space. And you get this feeling of relations between objects, whether they're spatial or more abstract, like objects having relationships to each other and things like that. So those are the core observations that IIT makes, and then it formulates those observations into postulates, which is just a fancy way of saying, like, if that property were to exist in like a physical system that we could measure, what would it look like? And so it's usually formulated in terms of cause-effect power, and they have a lot of mathematics that sort of derive out complex examples of that.
Would you also care to bring up the phi value that we had been discussing earlier?
Yes. So all of these mathematics that combine all of these axioms and postulates together, you can calculate a value that essentially says how much integrated information is there in a system, and that value is represented by the Greek letter phi. And IIT has seen several revisions. We're on version 4.0 now, but there's been several revisions in these mathematics and what exactly phi is and how it's calculated. And so the most recent version actually has several different versions of phi, which complicate things. But the first version of phi they call phi s, which is system phi, which this version of phi essentially measures how much do you exist for yourself. And so we use this version of phi when we are calculating where the boundaries of your substrate are. So, like, for example, in the brain, we want to know where the edges of sort of the neurons that matter for your consciousness are. Where is the basis for your consciousness? Where is the substrate? And so to calculate this, we have to compute all possible combinations of the 100 billion neurons to figure out which combination of some of them has the most system phi, or phi s, which is it's measuring how much information is intrinsically integrated within that system, which is sort of a complicated mathematical rabbit hole. But the important piece here, to just describe it conceptually, is how much information is being integrated or essentially represented in an informative way within this complex. So if you are if you're passing in information to the system, but then the information doesn't do anything, then it's not integrated, right? You have to be using and at least being able to sort of integrate across your units in a way that it isn't noisy, right? You have to have this information intrinsically. And so the system phi variable is used in calculating the borders of the substrate and figuring out which set of neurons or whatever your elements of your substrate are actually part of your biggest substrate, the one that actually exists.
So what sort of shape can you draw around your neurons such that this phi value is maximized?
Yes, and they have a principle in IIT which is called the principle of maximal existence. So the thing that exists is the thing that exists the most, and they define that as the phi s variable, which it's measuring cause-effect power in a way. And so the integrated information is measuring how much cause effect power the system has over itself. And by over itself, I mean how much does the current state of these units affect the next state that these units will have in the next time step, right? And the amount of cause effect power that it has in that instance will be represented in this phi value. So phi s is measuring how much does the system exist for itself and have cause effect power over itself. And the combination of units that has the most of that is the one that exists the most, and therefore that's the one that exists intrinsically and is conscious by this definition.
Sure. So, like, if I punch a rock, then the surface of the atoms of the rock that I hit, they're all going to transfer a little bit of energy to the next atom, and it's going to send basically a sound wave through that rock. But it's essentially not changing anything in the way that the rock is behaving, or at least in any sort of like unified, coherent way. It's just a random vibration passing through the entire thing. Whereas if you punch my toe, then since those neurons become activated, then they become part of my conscious perception, those pain neurons, and then I experience pain, and then I will have a reaction, whether it's crying or getting angry or something. It's going to have a major impact on what my thoughts are going to be for the next few minutes, and my mood and everything else that is part of my conscious perception.
Yeah, and to refine your terminology a little bit, the reason that the rock isn't conscious, and you can tell us when you hit it, is that when you do hit it, all of the atom by atom effects of the rock are very predictable. They're all feed forward, right? I hit this atom, it bounces into the next atom, which bounces into the next atom. So there isn't really much complexity there. It's a feed forward transfer of energy. And sure, the atoms might bounce around a little bit in a complex fashion, but for the most part, that's a pretty predictable reaction. And there's actually a really great analogy to this, which is one of the ways that the people related to sort of the IIT research line are trying to measure this in humans is it's called a perturbational, it's called PCI, I think it's Perturbational Complexity Index, which the way you measure this is really funny. You take an electrode to a person's head and you zap them with a big bolt of electricity, and then you use EEG, which is just a bunch of electrodes on your head, to measure the complexity of the activity in the brain. And based on how complex the reaction is in the brain when you just jolt a bunch of electricity through it, you can make a very, very rough calculation of how conscious the person is. Because when you do this during sleep or during coma or during anesthesia, the complexity in the brain will be much lower than during waking states, conscious states. And so this is a good example of, because there is more complexity in the system, there's more integration, right? And complexity is it breaks down on some level. It's not exactly analogous to integration, but it can sometimes be a useful substitute for it. And it's a good example of why the rock in this case isn't conscious, because it doesn't really have a strong ability to affect its future states. Because when you hit the rock, all of the cause effect that happens in the preceding collision of atoms can be traced back to this external event. Whereas in the brain, when you stimulate it, if the reaction is very complex and can't necessarily be easily attributed to the initial shock, then it's very easy to say, wow, the system has a lot of cause effect power on its future states, because the effect based on the stimulus was very unpredictable. So there's other things happening there other than just our external stimulus.
Sure. So if your current conscious perception is, let's say, the surface of a lake on a rainy day, and you throw a giant boulder into this lake, all of the different all of the complexity of the surface of the water, like, you won't in a few minutes you won't necessarily be able to tell which waves are coming from the rock and which waves are coming from the rain, because the system already exists as a complex thing. That's probably a bad analogy, because a lake isn't very integrated. Maybe a river, and you throw a giant boulder and it alters the path of the river slightly. some of that alteration is coming from the original momentum that the river already has. Um,
Yeah,
would you would
and the I agree with your assessment that this analogy breaks down a little bit when you consider the sort of a lot of these effects that are happening in the river or the lake are being caused like by the laws of physics, and just because the laws of physics are very complicated doesn't mean they're unpredictable. And the brain sort of behaves in a similar way though, in which case you have a lot of intrinsic complexity. The system is doing a lot. It has a lot of cause effect power over its future states. And so when you perturb it, when you stimulate it either via a big bolt of electricity or something you're perceiving that's different or whatever the stimulus is, the effect on your brain activity and the states that your system takes are going to be much more complicated than anything you could describe with an equation or a law of physics, right? Because your system itself has a lot of cause effect power over its future states, and that's what's important in terms of measuring this system phi variable, this conscious variable.
right, since it exists for itself by itself, it can change itself. It can have an effect on the way that it's going to react.
Yes, and IIT has a very unique perspective on free will in this case, which it's very different from traditional perspectives of free will, which are essentially like how much determinism is there in the universe, right? That's how I imagine the question of free will is the universe deterministic, and or is it random, or is it somewhere in between, and how much actual like will do you have to change those outcomes? The IIT perspective of free will is that because your substrate has a lot of cause effect power on itself, the more cause effect power you have on yourself, and in essence, the more conscious you are, the more developed your substrate is, the more you literally get to pick your future states. And that is a version of free will that is very different from like traditional philosophical ones, but I think it makes a lot of sense as a tool to like observe how humans I think intuitively think of free will, which is, oh, I consider option A, I consider option B, and I make a choice between them. And then because I made the choice, I have some amount of cause effect power on how my body moves and the physical actions that I take. Right. That's how we imagine free will. And IIT actually is very coherent at describing that sort of
Sure.
effect.
And then another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is another axiom that you proposed, is the uh, essentially the distinct nature of if you have a system where phi is maximized, such as your own conscious experience, then that is exclusive from perhaps a larger uh, conscious entity. So, for example, if all of the stars that we see in the sky are actually just some sort of atom which composes some much larger brain that exists in a universe much larger than the one that we currently perceive, why would that brain, which basically the entire observable universe is composing, not be a part of my conscious experience? Or why would my conscious experience not be a part of that entity?
So the IIT perspective, which I'm going to add the caveat here that the official IIT perspective is this, which there's an important note, which I'll talk about more in a moment, about how the people who developed IIT, which is mostly the Giulio Tononi's lab out of University of Wisconsin-Madison, they have a very precise formulation of their version of the theory, but the ideas in this theory are sort of broadly applicable to many formulations, and the formalisms that the Madison group has are, they make a lot of assumptions to get to the math that they do, and you could definitely imagine versions of this theory that behave in different ways. And I think one of the easiest distinctions of that is this exact principle that you brought up. Under the official Madison formulation of the theory, only things that are essentially a local maximum exist for itself. So your brain is a local maximum of its substrate, and because your brain interacts with the rest of reality through very limited means, right? It can't convey very much information. Like me talking to you right now is not conveying enough intrinsic information to make us one conscious entity. There's a clear fault line in the amount of integration that's happening between your brain and my brain. And so IIT predicts, okay, we have two local maximums, and there is no one conscious entity that encompasses both of us, because the fact that I'm conscious and the fact that you're conscious necessarily excludes any conscious entity from including both of us, or even a part of one of us. And so there is no universal consciousness under this formulation of IIT. There is no universal, like, God consciousness that is infinitely encompassing all of reality under this formulation of IIT. But one could easily imagine a version of IIT where this exclusion axiom doesn't work this way, right? And I said this earlier, that to assume other conscious entities don't exist that overlap with yours, I don't think is a very ontologically strong assumption, because you can't necessarily introspect into the existence of another possible consciousness. And so, in principle, you could have overlapping consciousnesses that share part of a substrate, and just because they're each integrated for themselves, they don't have access to each other's experiences. And in that version of IIT, which is not the official version, but I think it's definitely one that is coherent, you would have not just, say, a universal God consciousness, not just one that includes the stars and you, but you would also have potentially a near infinite amount of conscious entities within your own head, because now it's not just the one consciousness that is you that you're experiencing right now. There is another one that includes all of the same neurons and one more, right? Maybe it includes one cerebellum neuron that's just really integrated. And then there's a whole other one that includes two neurons, right? And you see the problem here in that if you're trying to formulate precise mathematics to describe your conscious experience, you have to have the exclusion postulate, because otherwise you have no way to draw the border, right? What's the one that exists the most in your head? What's the one that describes my experience right now? How do you pick? And
okay, so that's kind of what this theory is answering, is that specific question. It's not trying to answer is there a unified God consciousness. We're just saying,
yeah, because how would you know?
Has...
How would you know? The universal
Exactly.
God consciousness doesn't talk to you like I talk to you, right?
Yeah, and it also doesn't have a direct effect over my life, in the sense that it's not taking control of me and possessing me and forcing me to make any sort of decisions unless I'm completely unconscious of that, which I have no evidence for that, and it seems, Occam's razor type situation.
Yeah, but in principle, that would be sort of a strong panpsychist interpretation of IIT. Like, maybe IIT is completely right except for the exclusion postulate, and so there really are an infinite number of conscious entities that all sort of overlap with each other in weird ways, and it's just this one that sort of has access to the language center of your brain and can talk about his experiences that we attribute to be like ourselves, or the conscious entities that can communicate with other people. And there are really interesting instances of sort of these type of questions in people who have I forget the fancy neuroscience word for it, but people who have the two hemispheres of their brains separated.
A severed corpus callosum.
Yes. People who have their corpus callosum severed, you can ask them questions about manipulating objects, and because each hemisphere of the brain controls a different hand, the hands will literally show different behavior. And so you'll ask, like, oh, what's your favorite object? And your right hand will pick up a triangle, and your left one will pick up a square, and then you ask yourself to justify, why did you pick up that object? And the hemisphere that's holding the square, the part that has the language center of your brain, will give a whole explanation about why the square is in its hand. And then if you ask them, oh, but why did your other hand pick up the triangle? It either doesn't know, or it will make up an explanation that it has, like, no actual basis for having. Because your brain is really good at explaining away things that even if it didn't, like, consciously choose it, like, your brain is an explanation machine. We find ourselves doing this all of the time when you really don't know why you took an action, but then you can justify it later with some arbitrary explanation. And it's really, really pronounced in people who have this sort of bridge between your hemispheres separated, because in principle, you now have two substrates, two conscious entities in your head, and one of them can talk and the other one can't. And so you have no idea what it's experiencing. But in most normal, healthy people, these are probably unified into one conscious experience, just because we don't observe this sort of behavioral differences. But
So in other words, the phi value is maximized among both hemispheres in a person with a functioning corpus callosum, and there are probably two separate maximized phi values for their conscious experience in a person with a severed corpus callosum.
yes, which
Or
is
probably more, because we people who don't have that have multiple maximum phi values, because like your fingernails, for example, would not be included in your conscious in your maximum phi value.
yeah, and this is the other implication of IIT, is that even though your brain is a local maximum, or at least part of your brain, in creating the consciousness that is you, there is a lot of other mini consciousnesses, in the sense of you can have very, very small sets of units, or sets of or just substrates with elements that are a little bit integrated, but like not to a degree that we would normally attribute like true consciousness to. But under IIT, these are real consciousnesses, and they may be very small, very insignificant, not capable of the sort of rich experiences that me and you have, but there still exist for itself. It still has an intrinsic experience. And so this is why people call IIT panpsychist, because it does have sort of these like pseudo panpsychist implication that there is a lot more that's conscious than just me and you. But when I was talking to Giulio Tononi, one of the creators of this theory, he would describe these mini conscious entities as ontological dust. In other words, it does exist for itself, but it's so insignificantly conscious that it isn't really worth discussing in the context of the consciousness that me and you are talking about, the human rich sort of experience that we scientifically can study, because humans can talk about their experience.
Right, it's insignificant relative to us, but yeah, relative to us. Like if we try to have a conversation with something that is way less conscious, like let's say a dog or a cat, we could still communicate with them and interact with them in certain ways, but we will essentially never be able to like break down what are you thinking or feeling.
I think you can strongly make the case that like cats and dogs and other animals with, especially in like the mammalian family that have very similar brains to us, like these animals are very clearly conscious under basically any theory of consciousness that makes any scientific sense, right? If you're saying it has anything to do with the brain or the way the brain is structured or the things the brain is doing, which is 99% of all serious consciousness theories that aren't dualistic, you have to attribute consciousness to animals as well, and perhaps to varying degrees and perhaps in varying significance. But I think that gets into a lot of ethical and moral questions, right? A lot of the people in the IIT community are vegetarian and don't eat like other animals, and I think there are strong reasons for that, but there's also this question of what do we really value morally? Are we attributing value to just how conscious a thing is, or are we attributing value to whether or not it can feel pain, or all of these other cases? And we should probably have a separate episode on morality, because I think there's a lot to get into there. But
separate episode. There's a lot.
There's a lot there, and IIT also has a lot to say about things like that. I want to talk briefly about the other sort of computational aspect of this theory. We talked about system phi and talking about what exists, but once you've gotten to that stage of figuring out what exists by comparing all possible combinations of elements in your substrate, just that minor computational task, we then want to figure out how conscious is this thing. And what I mean by that is how many distinctions and relations can be present within this conscious thing. How rich is the experience? How many different things can it represent? And I think this is the only sort of meaningful measurement of consciousness that makes any sense, right? If you're assuming that the level of consciousness is different from how rich it is, then it's really, really hard to measure or attribute sort of anything to that from a scientific perspective. Like, how are you measuring the level of consciousness if not for how rich it is? And so the IIT has a big chunk of math, which the way they would describe it is unfolding the cause effect structure. But now that we have our substrate, we essentially need to go back and re-perturb all of the elements in our substrate and figure out how they affect every other element in the substrate. So we need all possible combinations of elements in the substrate to be categorized and computed their cause-effect structures. And this allows us to find all of the distinctions and all of the relations that sort of compose this rich structure. And it's only once you do all of this additional categorizing and computing that you can describe and categorize and understand sort of the structure of this rich phenomenal space that they're trying to articulate. And so this adds like another several layers of incomputability to this theory. It's not just about figuring about what exists, but it's about figuring out once we know what exists, what is that thing experiencing? And that is actually more computationally intense than the first step. So, which was already incomputable. So there's a lot of practical. I don't even like to use the word challenge because it's really not a challenge. Like, it's fundamentally impossible to compute any of this. So,
Unless we figure out how to tap into the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics and split the universe into an infinite number of different universes where everybody's studying a different neuron, and then we all reconvene and share our information with each other.
that's essentially what you would have to do, yeah. And there was some talk at this IIT workshop about whether quantum computers will be able to help us with this, and I really honestly don't think they will be able to. I think that we are so far away from any sort of computation in the realm of the mathematics of this theory. Like, there exists a Python package for calculating all of this system phi, this cause effect structure unfolding. That we can calculate all of this in code. Do you want to know what the maximum number of units you can calculate in a system is before it's physically incomputable because of how many possibilities there are in the explosion of things? Guess how many nodes, Quinn?
I don't know.
Take a wild guess.
30.
The number of nodes that you can calculate using this Python package is 11.
11.
11. If you go past 11,
Wow.
It takes too long and you can't calculate it anymore.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing.
And we have 100 billion neurons. So
Well, we're close, so to speak.
yeah, so this is the problem with consciousness science in general, is that we have so much to calculate on that end, and we can measure so little about phenomena that to try and get even a correlation of things that are happening in the brain with what's happening in phenomenology is really hard. And you can design sort of simplistic experiments to try and test aspects of this theory. I think the most interesting one is the inactive neuron hypothesis, which, because IIT is principled on sort of being is the important thing, right? As long as you exist and you have cause-effect power on the system, then you are contributing to consciousness. The hypothesis then is that you can have neurons that pretty much never fire in the brain, but are still contributing to consciousness. So the question then is, if this neuron never fires during an experiment, but then I remove the neuron and do the experiment again, does your conscious experience change? And you can imagine doing this in neurons in like visual cortex to represent sort of your visual space. The example that we were talking about in the course is sclerotoma patients, like people who've had a stroke and some of the neurons in their visual cortex like don't work anymore, and so they see a black spot. But in your conscious experience, if I then remove those neurons that are still have cause-effect power in your system, like if they were to fire, you would see things in the spot. That's what it means to have cause-effect power in this case. But because they're never firing, if I remove the neurons, does your spot go away and sort of the space of your experience warps to fill the gap, or does the black spot remain, right? And I think that's a really cool experiment that you could do to sort of experimentally test one aspect of this theory and understand more about how brain functionality corresponds to your actual experience, which maybe I probably won't do that experiment specifically, but there are lots of correlations with sort of experiential aspects, mental imagery, vision that I will potentially poke at during my PhD here. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but my usefulness is limited as a person with a computational background. I usually don't get to do sort of the more involved experiments like that. I don't have the background for it
Yet.
yet.
But another interesting facet that I want to bounce off of you is, so those neurons which are inactive are actively contributing to the conscious experience by forming the black spot. So they're still part of the conscious experience, but
Well, we don't know enough about how perception works to say whether or not these neurons that aren't firing are the sole cause of the black spot. Like, potentially it's just other neurons next to it that are firing in such a way as to make blackness there, right? Like,
oh really? We don't know this yet?
uh, so I will preface this by saying that I'm not an expert on this research and I don't know that much about sclerotoma patients, but my understanding is that we aren't certain that it's the damaged neurons that are creating the black spot. No, that's the primary hypothesis. It would make the most sense, but this is an open question in phenomenology: is how does your phenomenology change with either damage to the brain or induced changes or perturbations in the functionality of the brain, right? If I just change the firing rate of a couple neurons, is that enough to change your perception, or do I have to remove those neurons? And so there are definitely people who have either done these experiments or who are gearing up to do them as consciousness science sort of gains popularity and scientific appeal. But there's a lot of interesting work to be done there that I'm not an expert on.
Got you. Do you have any other major points that you wanted to go over or talk about?
I think the biggest takeaway I got from going to this workshop of the integrated information theory was just how interesting consciousness science is in correspondence with the rest of science, and specifically neuroscience, because neuroscientists in particular are very close-minded to all things that aren't like materialist. I'm going to mess with neurons and essentially treat it as a computer and like observe how it works. And
Right, because in the past there's been a lot of speculation
yes,
in this field, which has severely damaged its reputation as well as the
well,
science
it's impossible
itself.
not to speculate because you have to make assumptions to get to any methodological formulation. I mean, IIT itself, as I would definitely argue, it is the most theoretically developed hypothesis for how consciousness works, and the amount of assumptions that they have to make to get to any sort of formalized mathematics it's not insignificant, right? We have all of these assumptions. One of them was the principle of maximal existence that I said before, right? That's not something that you can observe from your normal conscious experience. Like, from my everyday experience, I can't infer, oh yeah, what exists is what exists the most, right? That's not a conclusion I can come to. That's an assumption that they made. And there are lots
Right,
of
but
things like that.
what I'm trying to say is that materialism is also an assumption that you're making
Yes.
when you're doing science, and it has also been adopted as the primary paradigm of this topic of study and science.
Yeah, and
And
I mean, IIT
anything
makes
that
these
doesn't.
assumptions too, right? IIT assumes realism. It assumes that there is an external world out of your consciousness. It assumes physicalism, right? We have to have some methodological substrate to ground our consciousness in. And I don't think it assumes materialism necessarily, but it does assume other things like atomism, right? We have to be able to reduce our cause effect structures to the smallest possible units that can take and make a difference. And it makes these ontological assumptions like these in order to be even able to methodologically do math, right? You have to make assumptions. And so
Right.
the IIT is maybe more upfront about this than most scientific theories, which I think is good. But because we have to make these assumptions to get anywhere, the field itself is constantly held back by critics who are saying like, "Oh, why did you make that assumption, or this one, or what if we made this other assumption?" And that discourse is good, and it helps us get to a more well-motivated formalism and all of these other things. But there will always be these questions of, do you have the right assumptions? And when you have a theory that starts from phenomenology of what can I know about my conscious experience, you have to admit that there are things you can't know about your conscious experience because you are limited to that intrinsic perspective. Introspection has limits, and those limits are definitely reflected in the theory and in the field as a whole, I think. And right as I was finishing the workshop, there was published an open letter signed by like 100 neuroscience labs that essentially was calling IIT pseudoscience. It said, "Hi, this theory, it's poorly constructed, and because people think it's a leading theory, it might be like damaging the field, and it's causing all this misinformation of people assuming that its predictions are true, and it's completely unverified and in principle untestable. So we don't think it should be regarded as a real scientific theory." And I would disagree with this premise. There was a lot of people who wrote back essentially saying, "Hi, your open letter is garbage," which
Right,
was
because
really funny. But
because IIT openly admits the assumptions that it's making,
yes,
whereas a lot of scientists don't do that. A lot of scientists think that what they're studying is truth, which like without assumption, which is a far more damaging way of going about this than admitting that you are making assumptions that you have to for now while we're working with this limited information. Because this is essentially, it's not new. People have been studying consciousness and contemplating consciousness since as early as civilization. You know, this is one of the fundamental questions of what's going on.
yes.
But yeah,
For people who are interested, for our listeners, the open letter is called "The Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness as Pseudoscience." And then my favorite rebuttal to this was, it's called "Ambitious Theories of Consciousness Are Not, quote, scientific misinformation." And so there's been a discourse on this going back and forth, and I think that's it's introducing a lot of drama to the field, and it's really fun to watch. But it's also, I think, part of the reason that this field is not being taken that seriously by large portions of traditional like neuroscientific audiences. And so it has its drama and it goes back and forth, but I think it's very interesting and scientifically valuable, and I hope it continues and grows over time and tries to form better assumptions and develop itself for what it is. I think it certainly has value, and there's a lot of very practical research being done on this as well. We discussed earlier the perturbational complexity index. That the approach of sending an electrical pulse into your brain and then measuring what happens and seeing how complex and compressible it is. That's an approach that is already being used on coma patients in some limited cases, and trying to figure out which people who are in vegetative states are actually still conscious. And
wow,
that's a really, really practical and notable application of a lot of this technology. And it's still in its early days, but there are practical ways to use these theories and their predictions that they make to help people and to learn more about how humans are conscious, what it means to be conscious, and what we can do to help people who are sort of on the border of being conscious and we can't really know because they're unresponsive. So that's a very interesting use case.
I could definitely see a lot of potential with this, specifically for that topic of, coma patients and, maybe even trying to figure out like the probability of being able to walk again one day. Like, is there any communication? What are the mathematical values that we're finding? Are there correlations between patients who can regain functionality and something that has become paralyzed, and like can we come up with accurate approximations for uh, the probability of recovering, etc.
Yeah, and there are a lot of open questions in the study of sort of healthy consciousness individuals as well. I mean, just think about all of the interesting experiments you could do to test hypotheses like, hey, under the influence of psychedelics, do you become more conscious? How does the structure of your phenomenology change? When people have these sort of transformative God realization experiences or religious experiences or experiences of ego death and the dissolution of self. Like all of these things are very interesting conscious states to explore, and how they are represented in the brain is an area of ongoing research that's very fascinating and ties into a lot of this consciousness sciences as well. There was
That's a very good point.
there was a study on expert meditators, Buddhists. They did some Tibetan Buddhists and some Zen Buddhists, and they essentially said like, hey, they were at like a meditation retreat, and they said, how about we just stick like electrodes on your head and you press this button when you're having a transformative experience, and then we'll see what's happening in your brain. And they had really, really interesting results, and they saw essentially a decrease in brain activity of basically everyone who was in these like advanced states of meditative transcendence, you could say.
And
And
that would infer like a lower phi value, right?
well, this is the rough part, is that it's really hard to draw correlatives to phi values from things like EEG activity, because what we're measuring is the strength of the sort of brain waves that go over your brain, which the strength of your brain activity is can be in principle completely non-correlated with the amount of complexity or self-integration or cause-effect power that your substrate has, right? So that's a study where we really can't draw any parallels to phi necessarily, but we learn a lot about how sort of these gamma and delta brain waves propagate over your cortex, and how these states of ego dissolution are important to that. And the most important conclusion from that study in regards to consciousness is that the biggest changes in brain activity that you can see, because you can see sort of spatially where in the brain things are changing the most, and the areas of the brain that change the most in these states are the ones in the back of the brain, in the area that is probably the substrate of consciousness, right? If IIT is correct and it's this sort of very densely interconnected, highly integrated circuits and sort of the posterior cortex that are important for consciousness, then it would make a lot of sense that in a transformative experience where your consciousness is the thing that's changing, that would be the area that would change the most, right?
Yes, that makes sense. And it would, yeah, I would also like to. I don't know. I'm excited. I'm excited for where this field is going. What's the brain doing when people are having these experiences? Exactly. So I'm excited for the future of that. I think this is a great tool to continue with this research in the future.
Psychedelics are having a renaissance in scientific research right now as well. I think the reason that's happening is because big pharma got wind that like maybe they can sell these things for lots of money as a treatment for medical conditions, and so now it's getting like funded left and right for all of these studies, and we're seeing a lot of interesting results for results of potentially therapeutic applications in changing consciousness in certain ways, right? If you can change your conscious experience in certain ways, that can have a lot of therapeutic benefits, and so this is another sort of angle where there is a lot of practical benefit to studying the effects on consciousness of either these substances or of meditative practice or of any other effects you can imagine that would change your phenomenology. And so part of being awakened and aware of your conscious state, I think, is having a respect for how malleable and how much effect that the state of your phenomenology has on your life as a whole. Because all of the negative effects that you perceive to be bad for your mental health, your well-being, your status in life are all changes in your perceptual structure, right? Depression, anxiety, worry, pain, all of these things are quite literally appearances in consciousness. And if you can understand what consciousness is and how to affect it and how to change it in ways that are good for your health or that are useful for your life in many ways, that's incredibly valuable scientific research. And so I'm glad that it's finally getting more attention, and I hope that it continues to progress without being held back by all of the drama that is circulating right now.
Yes.
Alrighty, Quinn. Well, I think that is probably enough for today. We're well over an hour now. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I think that I agree with the majority of the points presented. Of course, we discussed my rebuttal of the why can't the God consciousness also be a part of my consciousness and vice versa. And yeah, it's important to keep in mind that these are axioms and postulates that are proposed such that we will be able to create a little philosophical environment for us to explore. And that's essentially the entire purpose of a lot of these.
Yes. I'd also like to state, for sort of the benefit of our listeners, that IAT is an incredibly complex theory, and I can do it nowhere near justice in the short duration of our podcasts here. I would encourage people to go read Christoph Koch's book, which is called The Feeling of Life Itself. That's a pretty good overview of the theory, and if you want more detail as well, there are many published papers from the Madison group that sort of detail it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can't even cover nearly a fraction of it.
I talked about this theory nonstop, dawn to dusk, for 8 days to get to an even low level understanding. I would say I have a reasonable grasp on the main concepts from all of that workshop talk. I thought I had a high tolerance for discussing consciousness with people, but man, you talk about consciousness dawn to dusk for 8 days straight. That was enough to wear even me out. So,
and even the little bit of math that we did discuss, we essentially repeatedly determined that it was impossible.
Yes, there's a large amount of indeterminability there. So, all right, Quinn. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and discussing this.
Of course. Always a pleasure.
I will see you back here next time for our more podcasts, hopefully. It has been a while since we recorded our last one, so I hope we can do them more frequently now.
Yes.
But
I agree.
All right. Well, I'll see everyone back on the next episode of An Awakened Life. Thanks for listening.